Fernand Braudel was one of the most famous practitioners of the famous French Annales school of social and economic history. And he represents a distinct movement in the practice of history, which has profound theoretical, interpretive, and philosophical implications. He's written many famous and massive historical tomes. What we're going to examine today are some of his musings about the practice of history and the process of history in its most abstract form. And they were collected in a series of essays called On History. The school from which he comes, the Annales school, was founded by the famous French masters Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch in 1929. And in many ways, it represents a very stark challenge and perhaps even counterexample to the model of historiography that we saw with Danto and other analytic narrativists. In fact, any thinker who stresses a narrative and story-like interpretation of historical writing will find a great challenge in the writing of any of the Annales school thinkers, whether that be Braudel or even Marc Bloch's several-volume brilliant study of feudal society. For these texts almost appear sociological in nature. Their studies rarely seem to deal with change, with dramatic events, with a story of before and after. They're much more interpretive in their strategies, and we're going to be concerned with looking at the nature of those interpretive strategies and the sort of history that comes from that and the resulting ramifications for the interpretation and meaning of history. Well, Braudel represents the conjuncture not only of the Annales school, but of another important philosophic movement and anthropological movement, I should point out as well, in post-war France, known as Structuralism. Structuralism, as we will see, is best exemplified in social theory by the French structuralist Marxist Louis Althusser, and in anthropology by the famed structural anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss. So what we will find in Braudel is a mixture of these two elements, of the historical with the structural. And his reflections and practice of history bear the imprint of both of these elements. Now, the American version of Braudel's vision of history was known as the New Social History. And it came into its own really in the mid to late 1960s and throughout the 1970s. And that is not only the American variant, but it also captures much of the flavor, of the ideology, of the structural component, and of the accent, which characterizes what was considered a very exciting, radical, and innovative approach to understanding the human past. I want to begin with what Braudel characterizes as the varieties of social time. And we begin by noting that, for Braudel at least, history is more than just the before and after of events. It's more than just a chronicle of one thing after another. It's more than simply, and contrary to Danto, storytelling. Fundamentally, what the historian is after is not so much a story, the recounting of a set of events, but an understanding of the nature of a society, of its culture, of its institutions, of its practices, which may or may not be best exemplified in dramatic stories and tales, may be best exemplified through other means. In fact, it may best be exemplified through the sort of careful structural analysis that we found in people like Max Weber. Indeed, for Braudel, the thing which really distinguishes the historian from the sociologist is not his methodology, is not his approach, but rather the fact that the historian has a slightly more ideographic interest, is slightly more concerned with the particularities. They both look to what we will call, at some point, models. But the difference is the sociologist is interested in the model for its own sake. The historian is like a child who treats the model as a toy ship. He's interested not so much in the model for its own sake, but to put it on a particular body of water and see how it floats. So he wants to place that model in a particular historical context and see what it teaches him about that context. But both are concerned with these models. Also, the historian is different from the sociologist in that he must be concerned, to some extent, with development. Not only with static structures, but with change, and change over time, and development across space as well. So the historian deals with a before and after, a set of changes, but not necessarily the dramatic narrative sort of changes found in the interpretations that are assumed by people like Danto. He's interested in change, social change, cultural change, institutional change, and we begin by acknowledging that that change does not necessarily occur at a steady rate. Okay? Different changes take place over different spans of time. And therefore, to account for these different changes and their different rhythms requires a different sense of historical time. We need each sort of different change requires a distinct historical framework, a scope, a scale, a time frame, which is appropriate to encapsulating, understanding, and explaining those changes. So we're going to discuss what for Braudel were the three principal time spans of historical analysis and relate them to the distinct temporal rhythms of social development. Okay. The first sort of time that Braudel mentions is what he calls the history of the event. What he means by the history of the event is a relatively brief time span that is suited to the study of things like major events, wars, revolutions, political campaigns. And it is also suited towards the study of individuals. Now, clearly, that's the model of history that Danto is thinking of. Histories of things like the Civil War, biographies, studies of elections, of the rise of a political party. And that is exactly the sort of event about which one could write a narrative, a brief story which has a clear-cut beginning, middle, and end with dramatic twists and turns in it. This is the history which most scholars consider traditional. The vast bulk of historical texts study events, short time spans, maybe 5 years, 7 years, at the outside 8 years, as little as perhaps 1 year. This time span has an extremely journalistic feel to it, in that it's absorbed with dramatic twists, with turns, with plot changes, with exciting revelations. It's the sort of history which is very similar to what you find in headlines and on the front page of a newspaper. And for this reason, like journalism, it's the obvious form of political history, right? One of the exciting features of political history is its dramatic twists and turns, the revelations of corruption on this person's part, the dramatic fall of a minister or a prime minister or a cabinet member. And it's precisely those sorts of quick, dramatic, exciting events which sell newspapers and are obviously the subject for exciting, brief political histories. Now, Braudel notes, although political history is primarily what is conducive to this sort of brief history of the event, all features of social life participate, at least to some extent, in this time span. Right? We could think of histories of science in which we could write a history of a brief time span which was very exciting or dramatic. Kurt Gödel ruminating over and fighting in his mind to develop the incompleteness proof, to work out the arithmetization of metamathematics. The history of the Manhattan Project, the construction of the atomic bomb. It's a very dramatic, short-term history. It takes place over a brief period. Within the art world, one could write of Michelangelo's painting the Sistine Chapel, right? A dramatic story with a relatively brief time span. So all social life, to some extent, participates in this social time. And therefore, it's understandable that it would have been so popular. But to the extent which it has predominated all of the other sorts of social times, so much that that is the first time we think of when we think of history, the history of events, of things like that, is a sign that we are far too focused on our present, or at least that's the way Braudel explains it. And it works something like this. The reason we are so concerned with brief time spans is because we live in a brief time span, right? We live fairly short lives. The events which seem profound to us, therefore, are the events that we ourselves have experienced. And we can't help feeling that all of history, the significant events of history, must occur within a similar time span. So we think because an important conjuncture in our life may have lasted 4 years, our college education, 7 years, our career with one particular corporation. We can't help feel that all of history must follow that same sort of time rhythm, a dramatic, a quick turn of events. Now, again, this is understandable because our lives do participate in that social span, or that time span, that temporal duration. And yet it does a violence to the past. The past may have deeper and more fundamental rhythms as well, which need to be examined. In fact, Braudel feels that this time span is superficial, in that it only engages on the surface of history. These dramatic twists and plots and turns, according to Braudel, really come and go, and aren't necessarily what's really important. Yes, we can look at Kurt Gödel pacing his room trying to think his way through a particular problem, but over the long view, someone else would have solved it, if not him. The more important question is the development of, say, the quantifier over the last 100 years before it. So we could think then of this history of the event as actually, for Braudel, a sort of micro-history, a history of minutiae. In other words, a history that focuses on the Second World War and features famous figures like Churchill, Roosevelt, Stalin, Mussolini, is a micro-history in that the real explanation of the Second World War, its origins may lie as far back as the War of the Roses. And its origins may lie as far back as the development of the steam engine. They may be the real players in the coming of the Second World War, the technical advances and political advances and structural changes that made this whole conjuncture possible. Okay. In fact, Braudel uses a metaphor. He describes this history of the event as the study of the very surface of a body of water. We see on it white water breaking up occasionally. And the surface is all that the history of the event gets to, the very, very top, and sees that as the entirety of the body of water. Okay, let me now turn to the next time span, that of the conjuncture. Now, the conjuncture, or large-scale juncture is another way of putting it, is an intermediate time span. It usually runs somewhere between about 20 and 50 years for Braudel. And it might be called, in fact, cyclical, because it studies normal cycles. Now, by Braudel's time, the Annales School had produced a sufficient number of very interesting conjunctural histories so that we had examples. Economic history, for example. The best economic histories are always conjunctural. They always study 20 to 50-year cycles that are natural durations. Things like a business cycle, right? That may run 20 to 50 years, or generally will. The rise and fall of prices generally has a rhythm of somewhere between 20 and 50 years. Okay? Recessions, the period between recessions runs what? Somewhere between 50 and 40 years usually. So similarly, events like that, as you can see, the social development of a business cycle has an extremely different rhythm than, say, an election campaign. And in a sense, we can see why Braudel would think this is deeper, right? We know it's the economy, stupid. What elects and unelects presidents? The dramatic twists and events of campaign stops or business cycles moving below the surface? Okay. Now, I don't want to suggest that the economic history or the business cycle or the price cycle is the only social development that works at the rhythm of the conjuncture. There are others. The history of technology, right, works at a conjunctural level. We can speak of the age of the solid-state technology, followed by the age of the transistor, followed by the age of the microchip, each of which seem to have about a 15 to 30-year lifespan. We can talk about steam engines or steam power being followed by the age of fossil fuels, the age of the Bessemer steel process being followed by more refined processes. Each of these technical cycles have a distinct generational life. Sometimes 20 years, sometimes 50, maybe somewhat more, but generally within one and several human lifespans, or generations at least. Again, the history of science works on a conjunctural level, right? There's the Galilean age, the Newtonian age, the age of great chemical discovery in the 18th century. And we think of great breakthroughs in the history of science, not in terms of dramatic twists and turns. Thinking of Albert Einstein, deep in rumination, only gives us the surface of understanding the history of science. Most of its developments occur over more extended periods. We go from the age of Newtonian mechanics to the age of Einsteinian mechanics to the age of quantum mechanics, and now we move towards another conjuncture, which we may have entered now, the search for the grand unified theory. And probably the most obvious examples for all of us come from the history of art, the history of schools of art and styles of art. Think about what Renaissance painting was. How long did that last? In Italy, in Florence, 50 years, followed by the Baroque, another style. You couldn't have a history of events, of brief dramatic occurrences, which accounted for or did justice to the development of Baroque painting in Italy. You would need to look at a series of artists over a 20 to 50-year time span. Similarly for the Northern Renaissance. Cubism lasts, what, 25 years, 30 years? Impressionism, about 30 years. A dramatic story of Vincent van Gogh chopping his ear off makes for a good movie, but does it give us a real understanding of what's going on in Impressionism? Don't we need a larger time span, one that dwarfs the individual and brings to play the set of forces that produced a similar style among people like Van Gogh, Monet, Manet, Renoir? Okay, so what we find in all of these time spans, all of these large-scale social developments, is that, in fact, the individual, who is the subject of the history of the event, is dwarfed by these larger-scale social and cultural transformations. These sorts of histories, histories of the business cycle, histories of science, are not as dramatic as the others. But what they lose in drama and in excitement, they may compensate for in profundity. Right? There's a depth to these sorts of histories, or so Braudel feels. There's a sort of resonance to the deep causal forces engaged here that more than compensates for the lack of glitter and excitement in dramatic twists and turns. And again, to return to our analogy, we said before, or our metaphor, we said before that the history of the event was like the very surface of water. Well, if that's so, the time of the conjuncture could be thought of as like a current that lies beneath the wave crests, and in fact informs and moves the wave's crests. Once you understand these deeper levels of time, then you can, with them, explain why you have the waves. Once you understand the nature of the development of the quantifier and the development of piano arithmetic and the attempt among logicians in the early 20th century to complete the logicization of mathematics with people like Bertrand Russell and his Principia, then you can explain in a much more profound sense what Kurt Gödel was doing. He was working on a project that had really begun probably with Cantor, picked up with Frege, worked its way through Russell, and then culminated after Lowenheim with Kurt Gödel. Similarly with Einstein, a more profound understanding of what Einstein did has to look back to the Michelson-Morley experiment and other experiments and results in the 19th century. And has to look forward to, say, the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, whatever interpretation we decide is profound. Okay? So there's actually a different rhythm of development of social life, because not all parts of our life, of society, develop along at the same time span. Okay. This brings us to the third and the most profound time span for Braudel. History and the longue duree. A longue duree means the huge duration, the long duration. And this is the longest time span of any sort of social development. It's not measured in decades, it's measured in centuries. Okay, what are some examples? Actually, the longue duree has finally come to the United States in some of its forms, very interesting features, some that, in fact, Braudel himself had been incredibly interested in. One is ecological history. I think of a text called Changes in the Land, which studies the topography of the New England landscape over about 500 years. I once used to call it, playfully, beaver dams over the longue duree. And it is sort of that. How does the ecology of a particular region change over a 500-year span? The changes are extremely slow and gradual. And yet the rhythm of development is such that over that span there seems to be some sort of unity going on. Deforestation produces a change in rainfall patterns, which then in turn changes disease gradients, which change and impact human population densities. So ecological histories is just one sort of rhythm when you think of the changing geography of an area over, say, 500, 600 years. Similarly, geographical histories, the histories of borders between nations, right? That may occur over a 600-700-year epoch, right? If we freeze that line at any one particular moment and say, is Strasbourg, is Alsace-Lorraine French or German? Well, I mean, that changes at any particular moment. Seeing it over a 700-year stretch, however, may show you that there's a process going on, perhaps a process of amalgamation. Perhaps it's neither and both at the same time. Perhaps it's heading towards something like what we find in Switzerland, the construction of a new nationality or sense of identity based on a combination of distinct linguistic and ethnic backgrounds. Well, examples that we've seen of this time span are the histories of civilizations. Civilizations develop at a time span of thousands, or not thousands, at least hundreds of years. Right? Any sensible history of Rome must begin with the removal of the Etruscans and run all the way to about 4th century A.D. And then it may still run another 800 years if you wish to include the history of the Eastern Empire, of what would later be called the Byzantine Empire. So the development of a civilization runs over a huge span. And consider how that changes from, say, our short-sighted event-like history of nations. We have a tendency to think of things like a history of the Second World War, a history of the First World War. Let's place them in the context of the history of Western civilization. They're brief temporary aberrations and blips. They're particular moments of civil war, not tremendously different than the War of the Roses, or the War of the Austrian Succession, or the Anglo-French Wars of the 18th century, or the religious wars of the 17th. They become part of a recurring pattern. They seem less dramatic, less dynamic and exciting, and part of a larger structure that's ongoing. There's been a fundamental problem of the balance of power in the emergent nation-state since the emergence of absolutism in about the 16th century. And power moves first from the Iberian Peninsula, then through the northern continental mainland, finally to England, and is challenged by Central Europe. And at the end, power then becomes distributed finally among the two frontier lands. To the west, the North American mainland. To the east, Russia. Okay. So we can see the different sorts of developments which correspond to this particular time frame. And it's this time frame which Braudel considers the deepest and the most profound. Again, to return to our metaphor, which I know I'm driving into the ground like a well, if the history of the event is the surface, if the history of the conjuncture is the wave, the history of the longue duree is the tidal force, the most fundamental, attractive force moving that body of water, the attraction of the greatest entity, that being, in the case of the tidal force, the moon. The rhythm of this time is almost still. A history of the Grande Durée, and Braudel wrote one, a history of basically peasant life in Europe over an immense stretch of time and space, just absolutely magnificent. It's a history in which there's almost no change whatsoever. Imagine someone writing a history of feudalism. You begin it in about 600 AD, end it in about, I don't know, 1300 AD. Braudel did, not Braudel, Marc Bloch did just that. It's a wonderful text, and yet almost nothing happens in it. The chapters are things like heraldry, in which there is an explanation of the meaning of heraldry, how it functioned, and they may mention how it functioned differently at different moments, followed by a chapter on the peasant, the manor, the serf, the lord, the court, the canon law. Each of these things detailed with a certain amount of richness, but without a sense of dramatic change and transformation. So it's an almost still time. It's an almost non-moving rhythm. And it's only in its interest with the particular and with development that it differs, in fact, from sociology. It's only in the fact that it's ideographic that distinguishes it from the sort of work that Max Weber did. Well, each of these times has its virtues, obviously. Different parts of history, different parts of society develop along different rhythms. The great virtue of the first time span is that it's dramatic. Braudel says, this is the time span of the wise man. When I first read that, I was absolutely mystified. I had no idea what that was about. And I asked the scholar I was doing a tutorial with at the time, what could this possibly, why is this time wiser than any other time? And he said, well, what are the sort of things a wise man teaches you? The more things change, the more they stay the same. There's nothing new under the sun. The wise man teaches you eternal verities, things which hold across time and space. They may seem like shop-worn pieties, but they are in fact practical rules of action. They're not science, they're not theory, they're practical, they're wisdom. That's hence the wise man. Well, that's what this time offers as well. Very little change does occur. It shows you how, no matter how many revolutions occur in Europe, fundamentally, peasants don't live very differently in the south of France than they did 800 years ago. They may have cars, but it's not very different. They still center their life around the local church. Their marriage patterns are almost identical as they used to be. Their labor patterns are identical. Their dietary patterns are identical. Things have not changed that profoundly. Their social life is not that different than it once was. No matter how much we talk about the transformation of the marketplace, merchants still engage in the same practice that their ancestors did in the Hanseatic League. They still buy cheap, sell dear. They still engage in collective marketing programs, joint stock companies, double-entry bookkeeping. They still participate in the same fundamental form of life. And that's the wisdom, that in a certain sense, things really haven't changed. The life of the intellectual really hasn't changed that much. Yes, we know our universities are secular, but they're still fundamentally medieval guilds, aren't they? Right? When you're made a master of arts, might that not refer to the old guild structure of being a master? Right? You're a master in the discipline. When you do a PhD training, aren't you, in fact, an apprentice who's become a journeyman once you get into your PhD training, being trained under a master? And he will decide when you have achieved mastery and can be let free to practice the discipline on your own. So how much have things changed there? It's that sort of a structure, a history of the university as a guild of high cultural producers that Braudel offers as a wisdom of the longue durée and its wisdom. Now, this time discloses, rather than the cycles that we saw with the conjuncture, something which he calls structures. Structures which exist beneath the surface of events, and with the conjunctural comprise what he calls unconscious history. All right, so what are structures? Think of a structure as a distinct pattern of relationships between persons, institutions, and entities within a society. So we could speak of, say, the feudal structure of relations. What would that mean? That would mean relations based on clientage, dependence, mutuality among unequals. They're personal relations, hardly codified in law, but at the same time registered by ritual acts. Acts like bowing before a lord, accepting perhaps being knighted if one is going to engage in military service, and then perhaps at one moment being given a kiss on the mouth to show affection and certain bonding. Okay, so that's an example of a structure. Very often, the entire pattern or the entire structure of that pattern behavior may not be something which any particular person in the society is aware of. Right? They may be aware of discrete entities, but not of the entire components of the structure. And in that way, it's unconscious. Nonetheless, those structures can be culled from a careful observation of behavior. Okay? So, in fact, people may not have noted that the feudal social structure was fundamentally one of personal hierarchy and clientage. They may have seen it in some cases and not in others. They may have thought of that in terms of military service, military service, but not have thought of it in terms of religious orders. But in retrospect, we look back and we can see that, in fact, bishops stand towards some of their the clerics beneath them in the position of protector. They have their separate courts, and those lower people could be considered, in a sense, their vassals. Okay, so from behavior, we cull a sense of these structures. And the linguistic expression of these structures he calls models. A model is just that. A model is a linguistic or formulaic exposition of a structure. Or a structure, better yet, a better way of putting it is a model is a copy of a structure. Structures exist in society, models exist in our accounts of those structures. And what these models identify are the most basic entities and then exhibit their relations. And at this point we have examples of such models. Weber's models of legitimate authority. 3, right? There's charismatic authority, legal rational authority, and traditional authority. Different models that exhibit different structured relationships within a society. We saw the same thing in Marxism. Modes of production are, in fact, models of economic structures, right? A capitalist mode of production, an antique mode of production, an Asiatic mode of production, and then finally a socialist and then communist mode of production. Some other examples we might look at. Braudel compares it to phonemic linguistics. Phonemic linguistics is a discipline which claims that all of language can be broken down to a distinct number of phonemes, or basic sounds, usually one syllable short. And that you can take all of those sounds, and there's a discrete number, and listable, and combine them to combine the words of any language possible. And that once you've worked out the pattern of possible constructions, you can categorize, first of all, not only what the languages are, but what their affiliations are. If there are certain phonemic constructions which are extremely common in, say, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit, we have reason to believe that perhaps they come from a common language. And in fact, we now do believe that. They all come from the same language. Similar phonemes are used to express the word, the deity, deva in Persian, deus in Greek, and I can't remember offhand what it is in Hindi, but it's quite a similar term. Similar sounding. Another example that Braudel draws is inframolecular physics. He believes that also portrays the same sort of modeling structured relationship where you break phenomena down into their smallest entities and show the pattern relationships between them. Now, perhaps the best example in the human sciences is Levi-Strauss's structural anthropology. Levi-Strauss examined the behavior of totemic or primitive traditional communities. And he found that, in fact, all marriages were, in a strange sense, communications or structures around the totemic operators of various clans, sibs, and tribes. So in a strange way, marrying a woman was making a particular sort of comment to her father or uncle. Right? That was the determining factor. No one in the society may have even been aware of this. But it turns out, with absolute mathematical precision, that that's always the way it works out if you keep examining the cases. In fact, it's precisely that sort of careful structural analysis, and Levi-Strauss, incidentally, in the text Savage Mind, has worked out a whole mathematics of this. He has intense charts showing if you come from the Bear clan and your uncle is from the, your maternal uncle is from the Eagle clan, you will have to marry someone from, the Snake clan if you are an Eskimo from this region. Braudel calls for historians, structuralist historians, the longue duree in particular, to employ just that kind of a social mathematics in their own research. And here he has in mind three different social mathematics. French writers often can be frustrating because, like Germans, they use words in ways that we would never think of using them in English. What he has in mind by mathematics are what he calls, even more obscurely, three distinct languages. Well, I would say what he means are three relatively rigorous uses of language, both natural and artificial. The first he calls the language of necessary facts. I think what he means by that is not an actual mathematics, but a modeling of social structures that is based on a straightforward deductive model. The use of straightforward nomological general laws. That's what he means, I think, by necessary facts, a straight causal deduction. The second language he calls the language of contingent facts. By that he means probabilistic hypotheses, rather than absolute general laws, which admit of no exceptions, probability laws and formulations. So something of the first order would be decline in the rate of mortality always leads to, and a constant production of food leads to famine over the long run. Of the second order, it might be that the intrusion of a virgin soil epidemic into an area generally leads to such and such a die-off rate. But not always, but generally. The last of his languages is what he calls the language of conditioned facts. What he has in mind here is something which is called game theory. It's something which I really don't have time to get into in great detail, but it's a theoretical model of strategies and outcomes. It says games might include things like if there are 3 prisoners and each one has been accused of a certain crime. Here are the rules. If one rats on the others, he will get so much extra time off, and the others will do so much more time. If none of them rat, this will be the result. They'll all get off, perhaps. Okay, they're completely isolated. What are the consequences of various behaviors on each of their parts? Work out all the probabilities, all the possibilities, and play them out. That's game theory. And it's precisely that theory which he wants to see applied to a history of the longue duree. What are the range of possibilities? What would happen if this was done and that was practiced? Okay. In the United States, the social history that emerged from, or that was analogous to Braudel's project, never really employed game theory. And it never really got particularly hung up with social mathematics. That was a particularly French structuralist thing. But it did, however, at the same time, perhaps accent to even a greater extent than Braudel had in mind, one of its great appeals. Structuralism, more than anything, recovers the history of everyday life. Consider one of the structures that persists over 500 years for even a relatively short history like the American history, which isn't 500 years long at all. Think about cooking. Have you noticed, those of you who live in Virginia and farther south, the preponderance of fried food down here? It's not a recent phenomenon. It hasn't just come around since Colonel Sanders. The prevalence of fried cooking, according to the historian David Hackett Fisher, comes from the particular region of England where most Virginians came from. They had been frying their food there for centuries. They brought that folk way. That structure persisted long after the development of ovens, well throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And it emerges in the words they develop in the 18th century, words like fricassee, the things like the barbecue. Okay. The Puritans who founded New England, on the other hand, came from East Anglia, a very different region of England, one which had been profoundly affected by a Dutch influence. And the result was the development of cooking in ovens. The principal form of cooking there was baking, things like pot pies. And in fact, the most popular thing to bake was peas and beans. What is Boston to this day famous for? It's Beantown, right? That's a structure which has existed for about 500 years, transplanted from East Anglia over. The area from which the settlers of the Delaware Valley came, according to Fisher, is primarily the northern Midlands of England, an extremely poor area which was known for actually an absence of ovens, in which the only way that they could cook food because of their poverty was stewing. To this day, that is an area in which popular foods remain mashed potatoes and all sorts of stews and stewed meats, despite the fact that the Delaware Valley became extremely prosperous extremely quickly. Okay, so structuralism allows us to recover these sorts of things. A history of cooking, a history of midwifery. Right? One of the things, an example in American history is a history of birthing. It is not the case that people always went to doctors. It's a very recent development that doctors have anything to do with delivery of children. Up to that point, you went to midwives. As long as midwives were in control of the birthing process, they were also in control of what we might call the abortion process. And it wasn't a big deal. Even among the Puritans, abortion was an acceptable practice before the quickening, before the child first started kicking. It's only when the medical practice starts to end that structure and intrude itself in that there becomes actually a medical debate about whether it is appropriate to perform those sorts of medical surgical techniques. So what we come to as we see the perennial appeal of a social history, of a structural history, is the realization that political histories and histories of great events like the Second World War exclude at least 90 to 95% of the human species. Think of, who is it, the great Marxist playwright, Bertolt Brecht is his name, used to have a great quip. So Caesar conquered Gaul without even a cook to help him, right? It doesn't make the history book, right? Rommel, what a desert fox he was. Gee, wouldn't it have been a help if he had a few people riding tanks to help him out? Would have done so much better. Right? One of my professors actually was in Patton's Third Army. And he used to say, yeah, sure, they used to call Patton blood and guts. It was our blood and our guts, his glory. And it's exactly that social history recovers. Most of us live our lives on patterns and structures that recur over centuries. And if we're going to recover them, recover history from the domain of a tiny elite, it will only be through a social, structural history. We don't leave great poems, most of us. We don't leave great historical legacies. We leave our lives, and our lives must be recovered structurally. In American history, this became not called the history of the grand duree or the history of structuralism, but was called, and perhaps the most appropriately, history from the bottom up. Right? You want to understand the American Revolution? Forget Thomas Jefferson. Let's talk about Jack Tar, said Jesse Lemish. average Joe Seaman walking down the streets of Boston. What was his life like? Samuel Adams didn't do the Boston Massacre. Urban artisans living in the streets of Boston did the Boston Tea Party. They were the ones who threw the tea overboard. What was their life like? Let's recover their social structural life. And that's the promise that Braudel offers. It promises to recover the experience of ordinary people and treat their lives as an integral part of history, as an integral part of the historical record. In fact, it's only structuralism that argues and urges the agency of the vast bulk of the human population.